English Short Stories. A Western Novel. The Ghost of Gila Bend. Chapter 1. The Threshold of Dust. Silas Thorne arrived at the outskirts of Gila Bend as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, bleeding a bruised purple across the sky. The air here was different, heavy with the scent of dry sage and a metallic tang that tasted like copper on the tongue. 10 years had passed since the town's lights went out, yet the wooden structures remained standing like skeletal monuments to broken dreams. Silas adjusted the heavy Colt on his hip, his joints aching with the familiar protest of a man who had spent too many decades chasing shadows for the Pinkerton Agency. He moved his horse through the main thoroughfare, where tattered curtains fluttered in empty window frames like the wings of trapped birds. His employer, a man of cold marble and high collars named Sterling, had been strangely specific. Go to the vault, take the leather-bound ledger, and speak to no one. But as Silas passed the local saloon, he saw fresh hoofprints in the dust. The ghosts of Gila Bend were wearing iron shoes. The bank sat at the end of the street, its stone facade cracked but imposing. Silas dismounted, his spurs jingling in a silence so profound it felt intentional. He pushed the heavy oak doors open, and the darkness of the interior swallowed him whole. He struck a match, the flickering light revealing a lobby untouched by scavengers, as if the very air of the place had been preserved in amber since the night of the Exodus. The vault door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of silver light escaping from within. Silas didn't believe in curses, but as he reached for the handle, he felt a sudden, sharp chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. Inside, the shelves were bare of currency, but on a pedestal in the center sat the ledger. He reached for it, only to hear the unmistakable click-clack of a Winchester being cocked behind him. Chapter 2. The Vein of Deception. Step away from the book, Pinkerton, a gravelly voice commanded. Silas turned slowly to find a woman in stained buckskins, her face mapped with the lines of a hard life spent under the sun. Behind her stood two men, their eyes wide with the frantic, shimmering light of gold fever. This wasn't a town of ghosts. It was a sanctuary for those who had stayed behind to guard a secret that could burn the territory to the ground. The woman, Sarah, explained that there was no curse, only a vein of high-grade gold discovered in the deepest shaft of the silver mine. The town's elite, including Silas's employer, had orchestrated a plague scare to drive the populace out, intending to return once the land claims were legally maneuvered into their hands. Sarah and her small band were the miners who had refused to leave, surviving in the shadows and picking at the vein to stay alive. Silas looked down at the ledger in his hand. It wasn't a record of silver production. It was a map of the new strike and a list of the conspirators who had murdered the town's marshal to keep the secret. Sterling didn't want the ledger to claim the gold. He wanted it to burn the evidence of his crimes. Silas felt the familiar weight of his badge, a piece of tin that suddenly felt like a heavy anchor in a sea of corruption. The silence was shattered by the sound of more horses, many of them. Sterling hadn't trusted Silas to work alone. A group of mercenaries, hired to clean up the remains of Gila Bend, were sweeping through the streets with torches and rifles. The miners looked to Silas, their faces a mixture of defiance and despair. The detective realized that his retirement wouldn't be found in a paycheck, but in the barrel of his gun. Chapter 3. The Final Reckoning. The first torch hit the dry wood of the general store, and Gila Bend erupted in a roar of orange flame. Silas led the miners through the back alleys, the shadows dancing wildly against the peeling paint of the buildings. He knew the mercenaries would expect him to flee. Instead, he led the group toward the mouth of the mine. If the ledger was the evidence, the mine was the motive, and he intended to bury both under the weight of justice. As they reached the ridge, Silas turned to face the advancing riders. He handed the ledger to Sarah and told her to head for the border. "This book is your life now," he grunted, checking the cylinders of his revolver. He took cover behind a rusted or cart, his old eyes finding the sights with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just a detective anymore. He was the final arbiter of a town that refused to die. The skirmish was short and brutal. Lead whistled through the air, splintering wood and sparking off the rocky earth. Silas moved with the practiced rhythm of a man who had survived a dozen such nights, his shots finding their mark with grim efficiency. When the smoke cleared and the mercenaries retreated into the burning night, Silas stood alone at the mine's entrance, his coat scorched and his breath coming in ragged gasps. As the sun rose over a town that was now nothing but ash and glowing embers, Silas watched Sarah's silhouette disappear into the horizon. He took the silver star from his vest and tossed it into the deep, dark throat of the mine. The ghost of Gila Bend was finally at rest, and Silas Thorne walked away into the desert, a man with no employer and a soul that was finally his own.